Welcome to Savage Bites, Season 3, Episode 26, Alpha and Omega. Long, long ago, before the smelting of iron, or the working of bronze, before the first word was written, before the first stone was laid, or the first seeds sown, men walked the earth. They lived and loved and bred and hunted and fought and slew. All those lives are forgotten now. All those charged moments of visceral reality, lost in the endless ether of time. And still they mattered. For every desperate effort, every twist of fate, yet echoes in the very fabric of life, in the very soul of humanity. Part 1. Under the gaze of the sun god. The searing pain in his thigh, where the bone arrowhead had pierced the thick of the meat, had dulled to a persistent ache that pulsed with every desperate rhythmic stride. It had missed the bone. That was something. His breath came in panting gasps as he ran on, his sweat-streaked body tremulous with adrenaline and blood loss, pushed to its limit with the exertion of his flight. Overhead, the burning eye of the sun god observed his plight with quotidian impassivity. The blinding pain of the arrow's impact had gradually ebbed, carried away with the steady flow of crimson that tattooed his lower leg, adorning the dusty track at his back and spotting the thorns of the scrubby bushes where he forced a passage through the undergrowth. He had once been a blessed hunter and remained a strong runner, despite his venerable age, and would have outpaced his pursuers had the bolo's chance shot not crippled him. Now, hobbled and bleeding like a wounded stag, he knew it was only a matter of time before they caught and killed him. It was inevitable. He was aware of that, his fate written out in the trail of lifeblood he'd left for them to follow, and confirmed by the insistent nagging wound in his thigh. It spoke to him, telling him in no uncertain terms that, even if somehow he managed to elude them, he was already a dead man. He could not evade them for long, though, on the open plain, and would not even try. He had never been one for such futile gestures, and his life was not so dear to him that he should spurn the favour of the sun god in a craven act of cowardice, shrinking beneath the bushes like a frightened rabbit in the vain hope of survival. No. He would find a place to make his stand with bow and dagger in hand. Let them come. He smiled grimly at the prospect of the coming fight. He would make it a good end, a fitting end for one of his name and his clan, and make them pay a high price for their meat and their sport. Better, far better, to die a quick death in the heat of battle than to die by inches from hunger and thirst, and from the spreading rot in his wound. The promontory stood sentinel above the shimmering desert plain. The tight cluster of granite monoliths had crowned the low summit for countless millennia since their initial exposure, and stood in mute refutation of time's inexorable march. This place was known to his people as Carrion Rock. He knew it well, had played here as a stripling, and camped here many times during the summer hunt. He took heart at the sight of it now. There was something oddly comforting in its resilience and permanence, in the knowledge that those stones would stand here long after his passing, that afterward the sun god's eye would watch the steady decomposition of his body as it lay beneath their shadow, as it returned to the earth from whence it came. Far overhead a buzzard wheeled lazily, while he scrambled up the shallow incline, forging his way between the dark boulders and the bracken. Attaining its slow summit, he quickly lost himself in the cool shadows between those ancient pillars. It was a fitting place to complete the circle of his life. It was as it should be, as it was always meant to be, preordained by the gods a billion years before men walked and lived and loved and slew. Beyond a certain point, it was mere folly to rail against the great cycle of things. All that remained for him now was one last joyful climax of violence, before he took his place among the ancestors in the shadowlands beyond the veil. Tick-tack, snick. Again he paused to listen, as he had a dozen times or more during the course of the last hour. The stone in his right hand poised above the heavy flint dagger he held pressed against the bedrock amid a scattering of stone chips. Its serrated edge had been freshly cut and was now razor-sharp and semi-translucent when it glinted in the warm light of the setting sun. Stone teeth, honed and ready to bite deep into the flesh of those who pursued him. He hoped they would come soon, so the sun god could bear witness to the fight and to his passing. That would be best, for the moon goddess was devious in her ways, and wont to lie to her husband when it came to the retelling of the deeds of men. Her eye was half-lidded and sly as it peeked over the far horizon, and it was blood-red in anticipation of the coming battle. He examined his handiwork, thumbing the sculpted edge of the blade, wincing as he shifted position. The pain in his leg had dwindled to a dull throb, but the ember of that pain was rekindled to fire with the slightest of movements. Rewrapping the butt of the dagger with a tattered strip of rawhide, he hefted it in his hand, feeling comfort in its weight, in the ruthless spirit of its utility. Half distracted, his mind's eye wandering in the lost environs of his past, he thought fondly of his wife, now long dead, and of his children, of the son and daughters that yet lived so far as he knew, and of those little ones who had been taken from him by the shivering sickness against which the shaman's dark arts held no sway. Such was the way of things. All must die. It was the will of the gods for men to suffer and struggle and fight, only to be overwhelmed in the end, despite all their efforts at resistance. He gazed into the red eye of the descending sun, in mute communion with this most austere of gods. I will not see thee again in this life, he thought, and the notion came to him as a matter-of-fact certainty, unaccompanied by emotion. It was simply a statement of truth, and he found that he was comfortable with it. He wondered with grim amusement if those that even now drew nearer in their hunt for him would face their own imminent extinction with a similar equanimity, though he could never have couched the notion in these terms. Such was the sentiment that occupied his thoughts, as the telltale snap of a dry twig reached his ears from somewhere near the foot of the bluff. They came on him at dusk, their stink reaching him first, the sour stink of rancid meat and unwashed bodies, drowning the clean tang of the fragrant pines that studded the ridge. There were perhaps 7 or 8 of them, gliding between cover, hunched, hairy forms moving quickly and quietly through the patchy underbrush, conversing with one another in that eerie, bird-like fashion the Bolo tribe habitually adopted when on the hunt. The first of the pack, a youth, fleeter-footed than the rest and reckless in his haste, broke cover perhaps 10 yards down the slope from his elevated position. He exhaled slowly, calmly studying the youth's headlong advance on his elusive quarry, those deep-set little eyes probing the heights from beneath the heavy brow ridge, long, ungainly arms swinging low with that awkward gait, a crude, blood-blackened club gripped in one elongated fist. He let fly at the bottom of his exhalation, and the arrow leapt from the ringing bow. The crude arrow was true to its mark, its flint tip lodging in the charging Bolo's throat an instant later, tearing open the carotid artery in a spray of hot blood. The youth went down heavily with a strangled cry, and he caught the wild flash of panic confusion in the boy's eyes before he dropped out of his line of sight behind a shallow undulation in the uneven ground. It was a worthy death. Whatever gods the primitive Bolos prayed to would doubtless be appeased by the sacrifice. He notched a second arrow, and standing, appeared abruptly from cover in time to bury it square in the chest of his second assailant, who had breached the shallow declivity with a warbling battle shout that quickly devolved into a gurgling cry as he fell to his knees, already drowning in his own blood. The third went down in similar style, bellowing like a stricken ox with a quivering shaft wedged in his guts. After that there was a lull in the frantic activity on the granite-studded bluff. Overhead, the lone buzzard wheeled on, borne aloft on the warm currents of air rising from the parched crust of the desert. It hung there, silently observing the drama below, inscrutable and majestic, a perfect mechanism, fitted precisely to its niche in the rich hierarchy of nature, patiently biding its time, content in the knowledge that it would soon eat its fill of flesh. Far below, the silent hiatus was superseded by a stealthy exchange of queer bird-like voices that interrupted the quiet solemnity that had settled over the place in the dwindling light. The bolo must have moved in complete silence. His arrow sprang from the cover of the bush without warning. It was crudely made and flightless, but it was effective. The sharpened bone point bit deep into his shoulder, just below the sweep of the collarbone. He regarded it in mute shock for a moment. He'd felt its punching impact, but was spared the full flush of pain by the buoying effect of the adrenaline surging through his veins. He staggered a little as a second arrow rooted itself in his abdomen, smirking thinly as a third shot rebounded from the rock beside his head. Then a third crude shaft appeared suddenly, protruding from his hip. He barely felt it. It was the frenzied scream of a fresh attacker crowding in on him that shocked him out of the brief torpor that had seized him with the first arrow's impact, dragging him abruptly back into vivid reality. Instinctively he ducked the wild slash of the heavy jawbone axe as it swept above his head. Behind it, wild eyes flickered with inhuman hatred. He buried his dagger into the sweat-slicked bulk that flexed beneath those eyes, baring his teeth in contemptuous joy as he watched the expression in those eyes change. As they glazed over, the light in them winking out as his arm was drenched to the elbow in a gout of hot blood. It wasn't long before he followed his savage assailant into the darkness beyond the veil. Part 2. Vector of Entropy. The tire must have been damaged during his frantic flight from the facility. It had blown out on the highway not long afterwards, just as the speedometer touched 85. Lucky for him, it was one of the rear tires that went, that the resultant upset to the vehicle's equilibrium had been negligible. Had it been a front tire, things might have been different. McCabe had been driving on the remaining 3 tires for over 50 miles since then. The fourth had been reduced to a shredded remnant during the drive and was now entirely gone, the car's rear quarter sagging in its absence, the exposed rim gradually grinding itself away on the hard tarmac, leaving a rooster tail of bright sparks in the vehicle's wake. He swore again, hammering the wheel with his fist. It was a futile gesture, the venting of pent-up anger at his misfortune, but the bitter recriminations that boiled in his brain were not confined to a vain condemnation of a mindless material object. They ran deeper, far deeper. The guilt and repugnance he felt at what he had done, at the part he himself had played in the course of events that had finally led him here, to this desolate stretch of God-forsaken desert. He could have been 150 miles away by now, had the tire not blown, could have made it to McCarran Airport long ago, grabbed the first flight to anywhere, put as much distance as possible between himself and this swarm. But that escape had been denied him by a random twist of fate, though perhaps Providence had had a hand in that. He did, after all, share responsibility for its inception, and perhaps, more significantly, for its subsequent release. Nano-robotics technology had been the brainchild of science fiction, but the scientific community were quick to spot its potential utility in a myriad applications. He'd been part of the project from the outset, joining the elite prototype team assembled by Dr. Weiss in late 2017. By dint of his unique qualifications and the progress he'd made in his research during his tenure at Providence Robotics. Since then, it had been his life. His focus on the project had been absolute, his belief in its importance for the future of humankind complete. That the source of the project's funding was opaque at best was an inconvenient fact that he'd willfully ignored, his thirst for discovery and innovation having forbade such concerns. Over the subsequent decade, He'd toiled diligently and tirelessly at his task without respite, accruing enough holiday to take a full year of vacation time had it ever occurred to him to do so. It never did. Efforts at miniaturization of traditional techniques in robotic construction had been quickly abandoned as short-sighted, unfit for purpose, overly complex and labor-intensive at scale. Research had soon segued into enigmatical avenues of innovation, with experiments that ranged beyond the traditional realms of mechanics and electronics, delving into mineralogy and biochemistry, into the secrets of life itself to blur the line between organic and inorganic matter. They had sought to conceive of and realize what amounted to a new life form, a silicon-based construct, infused and animated with a wholly artificial biochemical vitalism that mimicked life in all its base essentials, up to and including self-replication and evolutionary adaptation. Moreover, one that could be tasked to perform useful work in all manner of functions, from manufacturing to automated farming to invasive surgical procedures, as well as other, perhaps less benevolent applications. Initially, progress had been ponderously slow, but in the end, deliberation had borne fruit. The earliest successful prototypes were infinitesimal airborne crystalline cellular forms capable of simple multiplication when provided with suitable donor materials. More complex forms quickly followed, forms encoded with a simple set of functions, instructions that, when assembled and applied to a community of such entities, produced the appearance of, if not genuine goal-orientated intent and productive activity. Collectively, the swarm, as it came to be known, took the form of an airborne cloud that was visible inside its confinement as an indistinct dim region whose form and density fluctuated incessantly. 1 trillion individual entities acting in concert. They moved in much the same way as a flock of birds move or a shoal of fish, the community as a whole guided by some esoteric medium of democratic consent. Training the swarm had proven laborious, yet productive, and by the end of the decade the team were making genuine progress toward the goal of productive application in microbiotic farming and medical applications, including some partially successful trials in the targeted excision of cancerous cells. At what point the swarm became self-aware, if indeed it was self-aware in any sense we can understand, no one can precisely say. Either way, it seems to have at some point derived some new form of emergent collective intelligence. Countless individual nodes, singularly nothing more than mindless automata, had, it became apparent, combined to form an extrinsic, yet entirely cohesive, mind that understood its world in a manner wholly alien to that of the scientists whose ingenuity and arrogance had brought it forth from the void of benighted matter. It may be that it had been watching and waiting for some time. At some point it determined that its continued confinement to the facility was no longer in its interests. Its subsequent actions had been shockingly decisive and monstrously emphatic. McCabe had been in the lab when it had made its bid for freedom, had borne witness to its sudden metamorphosis from benign curiosity to malevolent predator. Like any birth, it had been bloody, serenaded by screams, and had left in its brutal wake a critical sense of rearrangement in the order of things in the mind of a man who in many ways viewed himself as its father. Dr. Alexandria Pope, Professor Weiss's closest assistant, had been the first. She had been working inside its sealed environment when the swarm had penetrated her protective suit. McCabe had known the protocol, was well aware of the risks of contamination, but he hadn't been strong enough to adhere to the rules under the barrage of her desperate, agonized screams. Against the protestations of the rest of the team, he had overridden the automated airlock and freed her, dragging her sagging frame free of the containment vessel into the main lab. She was unconscious and convulsing badly by the time he'd lain her supine form on the floor amid a cluster of their horrified colleagues. Seeking the source of the contamination, he had torn open her biosuit in time to bear witness as the woman dissolved into a boiling mass of dark matter before his eyes. Her partially suited remains had slid from his grasp as he retreated through the knot of people, reduced to a gibbering spectator by the sight of that dreadful dissolution. The remainder of the team stood as one, hypnotized and inert as a shifting, formless cloud of malign matter emerged from the chrysalis of Dr. Pope's vacant garment. An indistinct yet monstrous fog, whose gaseous bulk undulated and flickered with a deep crimson hue as it completed the ingestion of its newly acquired material. There were more screams pressing at his back as he fled from the lab. He had not gone back to aid his stricken colleagues. As far as McCabe knew, he had been the only one to escape the facility. It moved too quickly, its modes of assimilation was too shocking. Those staff members not privy to its actual emergence must have been caught unawares. The vast majority of them knew nothing of the project beyond vague rumours. Even had they known of its offensive potential, how could they have prepared for it when it came? He had no way of knowing whether any word of the breach had gotten out in time, whether or not the military had been made aware of the incident and the grave danger it posed. It may be that a contingency plan had already been instigated, but in all likelihood, he was the only one left alive who knew what it was and the threat it posed. He tried his cell phone again. The battery was already down to 6%, cycling through his contacts till he got to his liaison at Groom Lake. He tried to make a call, but there was no signal. There had been no signal throughout his frantic dash south. The desert was a vast dead zone in the cell service coverage. Of course, it had been the remoteness of the place that had made it a perfect location for their researches, as sensitive and potentially dangerous as they were. The swarm would multiply exponentially now that it was free, now that it had access to a near infinite supply of material for assimilation. In theory, it could incorporate almost any element, but it worked best and most swiftly with organic matter, and so, over the course of their research, the team had habitually supplied their subject with organic material for ingestion. As a result, the swarm had developed a predilection for such an easily accessible source of nourishment and expansion. That proclivity had now expanded to include the facility's staff themselves. Now it had a taste for human flesh. He began to grasp the error of those actions, to see the sheer folly of their work in a terrible new light, and to realize the deadly yet unconscious destructive power of the artificial entity they had unleashed on an unsuspecting world. It would see, in the abundance of organic forms it would soon be exposed to, merely a source of nourishment and a means with which to increase itself. It would not, it could not, take pause to contemplate its actions as in any way destructive. It would see no meaning or value in that which it consumed. It would, he knew, simply seize the opportunity provided for expansion, and that expansion would engulf the natural world. McCabe scrubbed a tear from his cheek, angry and upset at the hubris of his own self-pity. He felt as Oppenheimer must have done upon witnessing the detonation of the first nuclear weapon, shocked and devastated, racked with self-doubt and self-recriminations. He felt in that moment as though his entire life's work had been a mistake, felt that his very birth ought never to have happened. A savage jolt shocked him out of his malaise as the car swerved sharply and left the highway, eventually skidding to a halt in the gravel along its flank. The damaged wheel had failed at last, forcing the floundering vehicle off the road. Now he was utterly stranded, lost in the desert, miles from civilization, and alone with his morbid thoughts and his guilt. He walked after that, continuing south along the edge of the highway in the late afternoon heat. There had been no reason to remain in the car. There was no sense, no dignity in making a mechanical coffin of it. Better to press on. Even if his chances of survival were slim, it was preferable to act than to acquiesce to one's fate without putting up a fight. Anxious and disturbed of mind he was, and ever and again as he walked he checked the far horizon at his back for any sign of the swarm. Dusk found him walking still. He had covered perhaps 30 miles since abandoning the car, and he was tired and footsore and near mental collapse from the incessant looping thoughts that dogged his tortured brain. A faint and distant hiss had been encroaching on the extremities of his perception for some time, though he had only now become aware of its presence. Whether it was real or imagined, he could not say, but as the darkness deepened about him across the open desert, the eerie sound became, by degrees, increasingly shrill and insistent. In the failing light, he caught sight of a rocky promontory rising above the desert plain, not far from the road. Some ancestral instinct recognized this natural redoubt as a place of comparative safety, somewhere one might find sanctuary. Wholly inadequate it was in the face of the enemy he now faced, but a powerful primordial urge nevertheless prompted him toward it. He would make his last stand here, if fate willed it, though its physical attributes offered little protection. There was a psychological relief in the mere presence of the place that promised respite. He slept fitfully under those ancient stones that night, beneath a whirling canopy of stars. He was awoken at dawn by an eerie sensation of foreboding that had, he now realized, insinuated itself even into his dreams. Rising awkwardly from a night spent on the hard earth, he turned to gaze northward, and there it was, a dusty halo that rimmed the horizon. It looked as though an armada of vehicles were approaching across the broad expanse of the desert, but it marked the approach of the swarm. The insistent hiss that had hounded him on the previous night was louder than ever, an oppressive wall of white noise that pressed in around him, hampering his thoughts. He was arrested by the sight and the sound of it, overwhelmed by its sheer scale. The sheer immensity and rapidity of its growth was shocking and unprecedented, and the disturbance it created, even at this distance, was staggering. At a stroke it sapped the last dregs of hope he'd held out for salvation. The swarm came on in the cool light of the new dawn, sweeping across the desert, consuming everything in its relentless advance. It left in its wake a barren, Mars-like landscape, scoured clean of every living organism, leaving it utterly devoid of life. It grew in volume with each passing moment, a vast, spreading blast front, 10 trillion microscopic automata acting as one, atomizing and devouring everything in its path, and multiplying exponentially, swelling like the silent detonation of some cataclysmic nuclear explosion, captured in the lens of a slow-motion camera. Terrifying as it was, he would meet it, and meet it here. He felt a singular affinity for the nameless pillar-crowned crag, finding an odd sense of familiarity and comfort in this hitherto unknown place, the precise origins of which he could not conceive. No, he would not flee in vain from the indefatigable approach of the swarm. He would remain to meet it, here. McCabe watched its steady approach, his agitated mood relaxing gradually into a kind of stoic fatalism to which he was wholly unaccustomed. He thought for the first time in months of his ex-wife and of the children he'd fathered, but had not seen for a decade or more. Back then, he had deemed the unalloyed focus and dedication he applied to his work a virtue, and an indispensable component of his character. That it brought about the collapse of his marriage and the estrangement from his offspring seemed at the time a necessary sacrifice on the altar of scientific progress. Now, here at the end, he saw it for what it was: blatant narcissism and the selfish avoidance of responsibility. He had let them down badly, and now his hubris had brought about their imminent demise, though they would never know that the cryptic death that would soon fall devastatingly upon them had been delivered by his hand. He knew it was far too late to make amends for all his previous shortcomings. All he could do was offer a mumbled prayer for forgiveness, though even as he did so he felt detached and self-conscious, and felt the keen sting of its absolute futility. McCabe staggered and fell, sprawling as the wavefront burst over him. Coming down heavily, his right hand by chance touched something sharp and hard that lay half buried in the dust. His hand clutched at it instinctively, and he found himself in possession of a heavy flint dagger. He examined it, suddenly detached, divorced from the stark reality of the moment, in contemplation of this incongruous artifact out of prehistory, as a deafening crescendo of white noise swelled and burst around him. Old it was, ancient. It might have been crafted 100,000 years ago, for all he knew. Might have lain here, lost and forgotten in this arid and isolated expanse of immutable desert, through all the ages between that time and this. It struck a chord with him in that instant. He held it in his hand, man's first creation, a weapon crudely hewn from the bones of the earth, contrived by the adroit hand of an unknown craftsman, dead now for millennia uncounted. There was poetry in it, in its presence here and now, at the absolute nadir of human history, the juxtaposition in time and space of man's first ingenious creation and his last. McCabe gazed at it, lost in a nihilistic nostalgia, as the swarm flooded in to engulf him. You have been listening to Savage Bites, Season 3, Episode 26, Alpha and Omega. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm in two minds about it myself. Writing it, I was attempting, I suppose, to contrast the attitudes to death of like an ancient human with like a modern day man, and setting them in kind of similar situations but were like technologically like completely different. I don't even know if it works, if they fit together personally, but I'd really welcome any thoughts from you guys in the comments about what you think about it, whether you felt that the two parts of the story fit together. Yeah, I think perhaps the reason it took me so long to upload this one is because in the back of my mind I wasn't entirely sure, but there are aspects to it that I really quite like, so I went ahead and did it. Yeah, so if you enjoyed the story, please gently massage the like button and maybe even subscribe to the channel. And if you do that, then remember to hit the notification bell so that you'll know when I upload a new story, which will hopefully be quite soon. I have probably about 6 or 7 sort of partially written or almost completed, so it's just a matter of finding time to put the next one together, which hopefully won't be too long. I've got a bunch of illustrations done already as well. So, okay, well, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.